hopefully that's recorded. So yeah, this is the third of the talks that we're doing this week, and it basically this is kind of covering the period from the time of the Battle of Karkar, which is the kind of the pardon me, sorry. Yeah, from the meeting point of biblical history and secular history. This kind of, we're going to be looking at from that point onwards down to the Babylonian exile, which is around 586 BC. So let's just kind of get straight in. So just bear with me 1 second. There we go. So yeah, just a very quick recap. This is the Kingdom of Israel in blue, and this is around the year 830 BC. Sorry, I'm just going to change the pointer to be a laser pointer, hopefully be a little easier to see. So this is the Kingdom of Israel, the capital is Samaria. There is the slightly smaller Kingdom of Judah, which at around this time period, say for example, the King Jehoshaphat of Judah is subordinate to kind of in an alliance, but in a sort of a subordinate position to the King of Israel. And then Israel is kind of the larger of the two kingdoms. It's quite powerful in that it dominates the Kingdom of Ammon, Kingdom of Moab, and to a certain extent the Kingdom of Edom. It's locked in a struggle with the Kingdom of Damascus, sometimes called the Kingdom of Aram. And if you read the Book of Kings, Book of Chronicles, you'll hear all about sort of the wars that are fought between Damascus and Israel. And yeah, they do quite a lot of that sort of. So this is the same map, just with different highlighting. This is the Phoenician city-states along here, clustered along the coast. Here you have the Kingdom of Damascus, as we mentioned, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and the Philistine states. The Philistines are not very important around this time period, but they're still there. Okay, so insofar as we can talk about sort of the next 50 years, if you had to summarize them in one sentence, it would be Israelite weakness. The Israelites, for a variety of reasons, don't do all that well. So Ahab, king of Israel, son of the king Omri, dies fighting against Damascus. Now, a couple of years earlier, Ahab and the kingdom of Damascus had been allies. They'd fought against the Assyrians at Karkar, but this alliance seemed to break down pretty quickly. So before you know it, the two kingdoms are fighting again over a city near the border between them, and Ahab is killed. Now, this doesn't lead to the immediate decline of Israel. Israel still dominates the smaller states in the region, but yeah, that will not last forever. So we know that there is a king called Mesha of Moab, and he wins his independence from Israel and Judah. This war is mentioned in the Bible, but it's also mentioned in a stela that is held in the Louvre in Paris, and Mesha gives his own account of the war. This here is possibly a depiction of Mesha, but it's more likely just to be a Moabite soldier. So yeah, this is the stela here. And this is quite extraordinary, I think, because it's, to my knowledge, this is the first account of any war in history that's actually told from both sides. So the Bible actually is kind of part of that. Now, the accounts are not exactly as we might want them. The biblical account is very short. It's mainly talking about something else, and it mentions the war in passing. And the stela of Mesha is a propaganda piece. So they tell the same story. It's recognizably the same details, but they tell it from two different perspectives. And the picture they gave is incomplete, but it's still very recognizably the same event. So this is the Mesha stela. Omri was king of Israel and oppressed Moab during many days, and Chemosh was angry with his aggressions. Chemosh is one of the gods of Moab. His son succeeded him, and he also said, "I will oppress Moab." So this is kind of the preamble where Mesha talks about how Israel is dominating Moab and how he ultimately wins his freedom from Israel. So he tells a little bit of the story of the war, but he leaves out a lot of details. The Bible fills in some of those details, talks about how Israel, Judah, and their allied kingdom Edom attack Moab, and how they win some victories against the Moabites and push them back to their capital city. But then, in a very, very strange event, Misha sacrifices his firstborn son on the walls of the city, and the Israelites withdraw. It's not entirely clear to us why the Israelites would withdraw, but there's some cultural context I think that we're probably missing. So I'll just let the biblical record. Then he, in this case, he is Misha, took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice in the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land. So it's a very, I think it's an intriguing sort of episode, but it's an episode that we still don't fully understand. But it is interesting, again, once we start to see the intersection of the Bible and history, we start to see lots of other intersections. Also active around this time is the prophet Elisha. So he doesn't write anything to our knowledge, but the Book of Kings mentions him a lot. So if you read First and Second Kings, you'll get a lot of the deeds and doings of Elisha. He also he's quite an interesting character. He is quite happy dealing with anyone from the lowest in society all the way up to the highest, and he's quite happy to give out to those in power, to speak truth to those in power. And in fact, he actually crowns usurpers to the thrones of both Israel and Damascus, which is quite interesting. So speaking of usurpers to the throne of Israel, one of the ones that is crowned by Elisha is a person called Jehu. And Jehu attacks he overthrows the house of Ahab and basically kills the family of Ahab. He also kills the king of Judah, who was with Ahab at the time. After he takes over Israel, he fights wars with Damascus, as Ahab had before him. But these wars do not go well. And at some point, Jehu offers some form of tribute to the Assyrians, who are on the other side of the river. And here you can see this is an Israelite ambassador offering tribute to the Assyrian king here. Some people think that's actually a picture of Jehu himself, but it's much more likely to be an ambassador. And if you want to see this, this is in London, I believe, in the British Museum. So after the king of Judah was killed in Israel by Jehu, the queen mother in Judah actually kills the remainder of the house of David that she can find and sets herself up as queen. It's not entirely clear what she was trying to do here. Was she trying to found a new dynasty, or what the story was? She also reinstitutes worship of Baal, which had been sort of stopped by the earlier Israelite kings. But one member of the House of David manages to survive and is raised in the temple, and once he comes of age, there's a counter coup and Atalia is killed, as is shown in this picture by Gustave Doré. The reason I mention this is because it's very unusual. I was talking about how unstable the kingdom of Israel was. Generally speaking, Judah is very stable. This is the only time in the kingdom of Judah's history that it is not ruled by a member of the House of David. And it's a very brief time. So, Damascus. Damascus reaches the height of its strength around now, and it does so because of another usurper. There are a lot of usurpers at this time, called Hazael, who is probably the most powerful king of Damascus. And he clashes with the Assyrians, and he's able to hold the Assyrians off to the north, which is unprecedented because the Assyrians are quite good at fighting. And he also all but conquers Israel and Judah. The Bible talks about the armies of Israel being reduced to a fraction of what they once were, and talks about having like maybe a few dozen chariots, a few dozen cavalry, that type of thing. He not only subjugates Israel, he sort of subjugates Judah. He also is able to go far enough south to start burning Philistine cities as well. So Hazael oppresses Israel. And one of the instances of this is actually what is known as the Tel Dan Stella. This is a stela of a king of Damascus, almost certainly Hazael, and it was put up outside the city of Dan in Israel. And this is where the king is boasting about how he's done this, that, and the other. It's a work of propaganda. It's possible that whoever wrote this is lying about some of the stuff they did because some of it doesn't quite match the picture we have. But you can also see that the stela is very badly damaged, so it's quite a difficult document to interpret. This writing down in white down here, that's the highlighting is modern. That would not have been in the original, but that is the first mention in secular sources of the House of David. In fact, you can actually even just see that there, these three things here, that's David, but without the vowels. So it's, I don't know, I mean, I suppose considering it is my own name, I have at least a certain amount of interest in these three letters there. So after the death of Hazael, the tides sort of turn and the balance of power shifts, and Israel actually becomes strong, Damascus becomes weak. This is mentioned in the books of prophecy. The prophet Amos, who's writing around this time, if you read Amos, you'll read descriptions of people living in quite a lot of luxury. They drink wine, they lounge around on ivory couches. This is a good time if you're rich in the kingdom of Israel. So here, to put it in his own words, you put off the day of disaster and bring near a reign of terror. You lie on beds adorned with ivory and lounge on your couches. And that's from Amos 6:3 and 4. So Damascus seems to kind of go into decline after the death of Hazael. It's not clear exactly why, but the Assyrians probably have something to do with it. They attack Damascus. They're not able to take it, but around the time they attack, we have records from the north of the region of other smaller kings who become independent of Damascus around this time. It's mentioned in the Bible about how one of the Israelite kings is able to defeat the people of Damascus 3 times, seriously defeat them. And Damascus there's kind of a power vacuum, and Israel expands into this power vacuum. At a certain point, Israel seems to have even direct control of Damascus itself, at least for a brief period. It's around this time that the prophet Jonah is active. The book that bears his name tells of a mission to the Assyrians. And even though the Assyrians are not directly attacking Israel at this point, they're not liked by the Israelites. They are dangerous, they are cruel, they have a fearsome reputation. At this point, actually, Israel and Assyria have a common foe in the kingdom of Damascus. But even with this sort of common foe, Jonah is quite famously not enthusiastic about going to visit Nineveh, and will do a number of things to avoid going to Nineveh, as can be seen in this picture. So this gives this is quite a decent map showing the projected boundaries around this time. This shows the southern kingdom of Israel, or southern kingdom of Judah, which is kind of dominating the kingdom of Edom. And it's quite prosperous, surrounding the Philistines down to the coast. In the north, the kingdom of Samaria of Israel is dominating Damascus and stretches up towards the kingdom of Hamath, towards the Euphrates River. And it should be, these two kingdoms are kind of in alliance at this point, and the north is kind of the senior partner to the south, if that makes sense. So this is a good time if you're an Israelite or if you're someone in Jerusalem either. Both Jeroboam and Mosiah are remembered as prosperous kings. The Bible does mention this. It should be remembered, though, that even though Jeroboam II is one of the most powerful kings that Israel sort of knows, that's not entirely what the Bible is interested in. It's not really interested in worldly power. The Bible is interested in telling the story of God and his people. So as a result, they mention kings like Jeroboam and Omri, powerful kings of the north, but they generally only get a paragraph or so, and then the Bible moves on. So when you're reading it, don't necessarily expect these guys to be talked about a lot. They're there, they're mentioned, but the perspective that the Bible is looking at is not the perspective of a modern historian. One thing that is mentioned that happens around this time is a great earthquake. So the prophet Zechariah, who is writing about the year maybe 420, not 420, 520, writes, "You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Mosiah, king of Judah." Now, this earthquake is mentioned, I believe, in the prophet Amos as well, in and around this time. And we have actually found this in archaeology. There have been houses that have been dated to this time that have been sort of wiped by a very powerful earthquake. It's estimated that this earthquake was one of the most powerful to hit the Middle East in recorded history. So it is mentioned in the Bible. The prophet Hosea is active around this time as well. He's one of the earliest of the minor prophets, and he prophesies that the good times of Israel's strength, they won't last, and particularly that if Israel continues to be unfaithful to God, that destruction will come. The prophet Amos is also active around this time. We quoted from earlier, and he talks about how the powerful people are using their prosperity to oppress the helpless, and this is something that God is not pleased with, and basically judgment is promised if the people of Israel don't repent and change their ways in that. Now, we've mentioned in previous sort of things about how the lands between the river in Egypt, if the river civilizations are strong, that they will tend to dominate the lands in between. At this point, we've seen that Damascus is in decline. Egypt is actually quite weak. We'll talk about that in a second. But Assyria in the sort of north of Mesopotamia is also quite weak as well. The reason for this is probably, we're not entirely sure, but it's probably because they're fighting with the kingdom to the north called Urartu. And here you can see one of the Urartian artifacts. Urartu is mentioned in the Bible. They call it the Land of Ararat. Basically, it's the region in and around the mountains of Armenia. And, pardon me, sorry. This is one of the fortresses or the sites of the fortress of Urartu. This is near Yerevan in Armenia. And Egypt is quite weak at this time. I'd mentioned in the previous sort of talks about how Egypt, if Egypt could be united, it was almost invincible. At this point, Egypt is split across maybe 3 dynasties, and the dynasties, they're not always fighting each other, but they do not cooperate. And to the south of Egypt, the kingdom of Kush is growing quite strong. So this, spoiler alert, this doesn't end well for those dynasties. So around the year 745, the game changes and the empire strikes back, as it were. Assyria returns to the international scene and returns quite dangerously. So a usurper takes the throne of Assyria. We know him by the throne name of Tiglath-Pileser III. And this shows the kingdom of Assyria roughly about the time where he's about to take over. The map is in French, so the names might be slightly different than we're used to, but it still should be readable. You can see that the kingdom is quite large, but it's not huge. This is a larger kingdom than, say, Israel or Judah, but it's not the great empire that it would eventually grow into. So Tiglath-Pileser III, he's a usurper. He's utterly ruthless. He's a brilliant general, and he reforms Assyria, which was already quite a militarized state, into basically just existing for and by the army. The Assyrian army becomes the largest in the region by far, and it's very difficult for anything, maybe Elam, possibly Babylon, and maybe Egypt can take them on in open battle. No one else really can. To support this huge army, he embarks on wars of conquest in every direction, and he defeats Urartu to the north. He forces Babylon into an alliance, which with himself as the senior partner, and then, like people before him, pushes west across the Euphrates towards the Mediterranean. So I'd like you to try and imagine that you are, say, a king of Judah around this time. what do? You're king of a small kingdom, and all of a sudden, this very powerful, very aggressive general has turned up. He's outside your region at the moment, but he's sending threatening messages to everyone. He's coming. You know he's coming. What what will be your response? If you decide to stand and fight, if you decide to resist this person, and no one else does, then he will make an example of you. He will destroy you, and basically, he will destroy you. If everyone in the region unites against him, he's strong enough that he might still be able to defeat everyone in the region, even if they all sort of form an alliance. If they form an alliance with the more powerful partners, even if they manage to defeat Tiglath-Pileser, you may be then locked into an alliance with someone who actually may be worse than the Assyrians. So sometimes it's better to deal with the enemy who's far away than with an enemy who's very close by. And even if you go and you submit, then you have to pay huge tribute. And yeah, that the tribute might be so heavy that your own people will overthrow you. So if you're a king in the region, it's very difficult to know how to respond to this. And certainly the kings of the region seem to be very, very confused in how they sort of react to this. And this is a tactic that empires throughout history use a lot. The Romans use it, the Mongols use it, the British use it. You basically roll in, you wait for someone to make a mistake, and then you pounce. And Tiglath-Pileser is very good at doing this. And so the kings of Israel and Damascus they're the strongest kings in the region. They want to try and make a stand and fight. And they're trying to force the other kings into an alliance. The king of Judah is not sure. King of Judah is a person called Ahaz, and he is just not sure. And to try and force him into the alliance, the kings of Israel and Damascus attack Jerusalem, and they're hoping that even if this guy Ahaz will not join them, that they can put someone else as king of king of Judah, and that he will then join them. So, do you remember the verses that I read at the beginning of the first talk? This is the context of those. So that gives you some idea of kind of the motivations of the people. So Isaiah, the prophet of God, basically tells Ahaz to wait, that the kings who are attacking him will not, that they are not the real serious threat. But Ahaz panics. Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and of the king of Israel who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace, and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin, who is the king of Damascus, to death. So here you can actually kind of see just the danger of Tiglath-Pileser. He has, by just sort of sitting in the region and threatening, he has forced his opponents into panicking. And so the armies of Damascus have been drawn away to attack Jerusalem, which leaves the region free for him just to march into. And not only has the road been opened to him to attack Damascus, which he wanted to do anyway, he's actually been paid to do something that he wanted to do anyway. So it's a very clever tactic. The guy is quite good at what he does. He's a horrible person, but he's quite good at what he does. And yeah. So as a little sort of ironic side note, it's interesting to note the names of the kings. So we talk about Tiglath-Pileser, but his name is not actually Tiglath-Pileser. His Assyrian name is Tukulti-Apil-Ishar. Tiglath-Pileser is the Hebrew way of pronouncing his name. And I think he would be very, very annoyed if he found out that we were actually using the Hebrew way of pronouncing his name all these years later. The Bible also, remember that Tiglath-Pileser is an usurper. His name was not originally Tiglath-Pileser, it was Pulu. And the Bible actually preserves this name in one or two places, talking about the king of Assyria as Pul, which is the same name. Also, in a weird sort of twist, the Bible talks about King Ahaz, but it's probable from Assyrian documents that King Ahaz was not actually called King Ahaz, that his name may actually have been Jehoahaz. and that the biblical writers are so disgusted with the behavior of Ahaz that they actually drop the word Jeho off his name, because Jeho is the name of God, and they figure that Ahaz doesn't actually deserve to have God in his name. Now, this is kind of a bit conjectural, but it's probably what happened. So yeah, the names of the kings. It's an interesting sort of. While Tiglath-Pileser has pushed across the river and is basically dominating the kingdoms in the Betweenlands, Cush, which is to the south of Egypt, has basically marched north and taken over the confused dynasties that were ruling Egypt at that time. So now the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, they're now subordinate to Assyria, and they're trapped between an extremely aggressive Assyria and a resurgent Egypt led by the Cushites. So we've covered a lot of ground, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff has happened. Does anyone have any questions before we go on? Okay, Grant, that's fine. Don't worry. There's a lot of detail that I'm sort of saying here. Don't worry if some of it is kind of unfamiliar, or if it's not maybe fully making sense at the moment. There's a lot of ground being covered here. So basically, all we kind of hope is that, say, the next time you pick up the Book of Kings or the Book of Chronicles, that maybe some of the context might seem a little more familiar. So we'll carry on. After Tiglath-Pileser kind of reaches the region, basically the fall of Israel doesn't happen that long afterwards. Tiglath-Pileser puts in place a puppet king of Israel, a person by the name of Hoshea. And Hoshea makes the foolish decision to trust Egypt and basically to try and revolt against Assyria. So he revolts against Assyria. He is captured by the Assyrian king. Samaria, the capital of Israel, is besieged and it falls. So we can see that here in the Bible. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore Shalmaneser, who's the son of Tiglath-Pileser, seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan, on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. So there's a few things to kind of look at here. So first of all, note that the Kingdom of Israel made the fatal mistake of trying to play off one power against another, of trusting Egypt against Assyria. This is generally not a good strategy, as we'll see later on. But it's quite tempting to do so because, you know, if one river civilization is attacking you, it makes sense to kind of call in the other one, if that makes sense. The person called So, king of Egypt, we're not actually sure who this is referring to. There are a couple different ideas of who it's talking about. We just actually don't know. In fact, some people actually think it's referring to a place rather than a person, but we don't know who this is. So when the king of Assyria deports the people away from Samaria, he brings other people in from other parts of the empire. This is the ultimate origins of the people that we later know as Samaritans, is the kind of mixture of the people who were deported in and those who remained. For those who were deported away, there were a good few of them, but not a huge amount. You're probably looking at tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. And sometimes people will talk about like the lost tribes of Israel and talk about all sorts of strange ideas and so on. There's a lot of nonsense talked about the lost tribes of Israel. To be honest, archaeology suggests that most of the people who weren't actually deported just fled south to the Kingdom of Judah. We know from archaeology that Jerusalem actually doubles in size at this time. So a lot of people just kind of flee as refugees south to the Kingdom of Judah, where they can sort of be taken in by their southern brothers, as it were. So after the fall of Samaria, Judah is now the last sort of the kingdoms of the Israelites. So it's not long before Jerusalem itself now comes under threat. So to give context to this, there is a Babylonian king called Merodach-Baladan, and he's not actually Babylonian. He's from a tribal region to the south of Babylon, from the marshes. And he takes over the city of Babylon and revolts against the Assyrians. He tries to form an alliance with Hezekiah. So it seems as if he sends some sort of envoys across on the pretext of congratulating Hezekiah for recovery from an illness. And it's probable that some form of alliance is formed between Babylon and Judah. And the idea is that Babylon is at war with Assyria. If Judah goes to war with Assyria and it's supported by Egypt, then maybe the Assyrian armies will be split up in such a way that maybe one group will be able to inflict a defeat on the Assyrians. It's a clever idea, but it doesn't really work. Sennacherib, who is the king of Assyria at the time, attacks Merodach-Baladan, takes Babylon very quickly, and forces Merodach-Baladan to flee first to the marshes and then to the kingdom of Elam. And from the kingdom of Elam, he tries to carry on the war as a guerrilla warfare thing. So Hezekiah tries to strengthen the cities of Judah at this time. This is quite cool. This is the seal of King Hezekiah, which we actually have, and we know that Hezekiah puts storage jars in nearly every city in Judah. Basically, he's laying up provisions. He's preparing for sieges all across the country. And these jars are marked by a special seal with the letters LMLK. We're not entirely sure what that means, but we think that it's some sort of government provision and that this is signs of stockpiling for war. We also know from the Bible that he does something to the water supplies around Jerusalem. And from archaeology, we know that this involves digging a tunnel through solid rock to try and strengthen the water supply and to deny water to anyone who's attacking Jerusalem. Also around this time, Hezekiah does some religious reforms. He tears down many of the temples in other cities outside Jerusalem. He refocuses religious worship back to the main temple in Jerusalem where it should be. The Bible also mentions that he tears down a bronze snake in the temple. Now, this bronze snake was actually originally made by Moses. It was originally a sign of repentance, but over the years, the meaning had become corrupted and it was now actually worshipped as a god. The Bible refers to it as Nehushtan, but this is not actually a name. It just means bronze thing, but it's referring to a bronze snake that was worshipped. And we know from archaeology that there seems to be a snake cult further to the south of Judah, and it's probable that this has some connection with what's happening in Jerusalem. And you can see here, this is actually something that was found. It's not bronze, but it's copper, and it has a gilded head, and it seems to have been involved in worship. So it's not entirely clear that this is what Hezekiah is dealing with, but it's something like this. I think it's very likely the two are related. Speaking of religious reform, the prophet Isaiah is active around this time. He's referred to as the Prince of Prophets, and this is because he is, first of all, he's an excellent writer, and secondly, he is also probably related to the royal family in some degree. But this doesn't stop him from speaking truth to power when truth needs to be spoken to power. Also active around this time is the prophet Micah. And both Micah and Isaiah prophesy about the consequences of the rash rebellion of Hezekiah's, but they also speak in terms of future things, in terms of a future exile and a future return. So they kind of speak about the very near future, but also about the more distant future as well. So after Babylon is defeated and the Assyrian armies have dealt with that, they move westwards and start to attack Jerusalem. Well, they attack Judah. Now, Hezekiah has decided not to face the Assyrians in the field. He has fortified all these sort of little cities all around Judah. And this is one of the cities, it's Lachish. And this is an Assyrian picture showing the attack on Lachish. So this shows the gate, There's an Assyrian siege ram moving up a ramp that's attacking the wall. These are soldiers of Judah. They're throwing down stones. They're throwing lit torches to try and set stuff on fire. Down here, you can see people being taken off into exile after the thing falls. There's a lot going on in this picture. But all you really kind of need to know is that the kingdom of Judah is attacked, and it's very badly damaged. Basically, all the fortified cities except Jerusalem are destroyed. Now, while the Assyrians are attacking the fortified cities of Jerusalem or of Judah, the Egyptians, under the leadership of one of their generals called Taharka, try and attack the Assyrians and try and sort of basically break the siege to try and help their allies in Judah. The Bible refers to Taharka as Tirhaka, which is very similar in terms of its name. And Taharka he's a general at this time, but he ultimately becomes pharaoh, and he does keep on fighting the Assyrians. It doesn't work out well for him. And this is actually, you can see Taharka here offering sacrifice to one of his gods. They fail. They are not able to break the Assyrian sieges. And this is a picture of this is a better picture of the siege of Lachish. And you can see all sorts of stuff is happening. This is a better picture of one of the siege weapons. You can see it's on wheels, it has a battering ram, it has towers that people can fire from. Yeah, the Assyrians are quite good at taking cities. This is their speciality. So what Hezekiah has done is no match for what the Assyrians are doing. But Jerusalem is not destroyed. You can see here that the Assyrians are very proud of taking Lachish, which is the second city. But why did they not attack the first city? And yeah, the Assyrians are very quiet about why they don't attack the first city. But the Bible does tell us that when they attacked Jerusalem, that the angel of death went and struck down many of the Assyrians, and that the Assyrians then withdraw away from Jerusalem. They do not want to attack Jerusalem. So, yeah, it's an interesting sort of one, because you have the silence of the Assyrians on one hand, and the records of the Bible on the other. I actually find it one of the most fascinating instances of history in the ancient world. But you know, this is something that I do find very interesting. So here you can actually see Lachish. This is later refortified to fight against the Babylonians. This is the entranceway. It's not the siege ramp, but you can actually still see the Assyrian siege ramp in a slightly different part of the city. So yeah, if you're ever in Israel, it's worth having a look at. And if you're ever in the British Museum, you should be able to go and have a look at this as well. It's pretty cool. So yeah, in terms of what happens kind of next, Babylon, the war in Babylon flares up again. The Assyrians withdraw their army and fight against the Babylonians. Babylon itself is actually destroyed. Merodach-Baladan is killed when he fights again. Sennacherib is then murdered by his sons, which is mentioned by the Bible, and he's succeeded by Esarhaddon, his son. Different son from the one who actually murders him. So for the next 60 years, Judah is quite weak. It's like, even though Jerusalem is not destroyed, every other city in Judah has been destroyed. So, and a lot of the people have been deported, a lot of the crops have been taken away, and the Philistines, the enemies of Israel, have been told by the Assyrians, take all this land. So when the people emerge from the city of Jerusalem, they find that they're in a very impoverished, very depleted kingdom. To try and make sure that they don't have to fight again, they start paying tribute to Assyria once more. So the Assyrians kind of don't want to attack Jerusalem because something protects Jerusalem. But they also, the people of Judah don't want to go and tangle with these guys again. So as a result, kind of, it's almost kind of like a stalemate, as it were. After Hezekiah's death, his son Manasseh leads the people of Judah back into idolatry. He kind of reverses all the reforms that Hezekiah has done. So if you read 2 Kings, but the people did not listen. Manasseh led them astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. So this is, by the way, not a picture of Manasseh. This is a picture of the goddess Asherah that he wanted to reinstate the worship thereof. And one of the things he does is he rebuilds a lot of temples outside of Jerusalem, trying to refocus the temple worship away from the temple. Meanwhile, the Assyrians are not happy with the fact that the Cushites tried to help Judah. So they try and push the Cushites out of Egypt. So King Esarhaddon sweeps his army down the coast road past Judah and attacks Egypt. And here you can see, this is in Berlin, it's a stela of King Esarhaddon, who is depicted very large, and a statue of Baal of Tyre, who helps the Cushites. And this is Prince Ushanahuru of Tyre. This is Taharka's son, who was captured in the campaign. So this map gives an idea of Assyria. So the darker green is Assyria as it is at the death of Tiglath-Pileser III. And this larger green, or sorry, lighter green, is the kingdom as it is around the time of Esarhaddon. So you can see the expansion that the Assyrians have managed to pull off. Problem with this type of expansion is that everyone hates you and you can't do it forever. So moving on to the last great king of Assyria. Esarhaddon is succeeded by a person called Ashurbanipal. You don't have to remember any of these names. It's just I'm kind of mentioning them in case people want to Google stuff afterwards. So yeah, Ashurbanipal of Assyria he's not a nice person, but he's quite an interesting person. He's a younger son, and his older brother is actually given the reign of Babylon and told that he has to be subordinate to the younger son. This does not end well. Ashurbanipal struggles to control Egypt, so he sacks Thebes, which is mentioned in the Bible. I think it's referred to in Ezekiel. And yeah, so you can see here, this is an Assyrian soldier, this is an Assyrian paymaster, these are some severed heads that the guy has deposited, and these guys here are recording how many severed heads so they can determine how much of a bonus he gets. These guys are really, really charming people. He fights a lot of wars in Egypt, but eventually he realizes the Egyptians don't like being ruled by anyone who isn't Egyptian, so he appoints an Egyptian governor. And so it says, right, he's going to rule you in my name. And this works for a time. The Egyptian governors are very clever in how to play the people against the Assyrians. And basically the Assyrians kind of withdraw from Egypt, having conquered it in name at least. He then has to go and fight wars with his brother because his brother is not happy being subordinate to the younger brother. So Babylon revolts, the kingdom of Elam tries to support Babylon, and basically there's a very long and protracted series of wars that Ashurbanipal fights here. So you've got about maybe 25, 30 years of very vicious warfare. And here you can see Assyrian soldiers breaking down Susa, which is the capital of Elam. And this actually is referred to in the Bible in 2 Chronicles, where it talks about King Manasseh being deported over to Babylon for a time. And what we suspect happens here is that Manasseh is being held as a hostage to stop him revolting. And the reason the Assyrians are afraid of kings in the west revolting is because the wars in the east are so difficult that they're withdrawing all their troops. So all the troops in the empire are basically being sucked into this conflict in Babylon and Elam, which means that Egypt is kind of de facto independent at this point. And Judah, after Manasseh returns, Judah kind of becomes semi-independent at this point. They probably still pay lip service to Assyria, just enough to keep the Assyrians away. But in terms of genuine Assyrian control, that's probably kind of ebbed away around this time, and primarily because of these wars. The prophet Zephaniah is active in and around this time, as is the prophet Nahum, who prophesies that despite how powerful Assyria may seem, like that they dominate both river valleys and the known world, that they're really only a few steps away from disaster and that their day of reckoning will come. Which brings us to the last good king of Judah, who is Josiah. So here talks about, this is 2 Kings 23. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. So what's being referred to there is the fact that Josiah, who is the great-grandson of Hezekiah, has decided to go and follow in his great-grandfather's footsteps and basically try and restore the worship of God. And one of the things he does is try and rebuild the temple, which had kind of fallen into disrepair. So to kind of restore the temple, people had to do a lot of construction work. And in this construction work, they found the book of the law. Now, we're not sure what they mean by the book of the law. Some people think that it means the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And some people think it means the book of Deuteronomy within those first 5 books. But either way, they found something, and this changes the mind of Josiah to really refocus him even more on reforming the worship. So he tears down pagan altars both in Judah and in Israel. So he expands his kingdom. Remember that the Assyrians have kind of pulled away a bit. He expands his kingdom in the vacuum north into what had been the kingdom of Israel. And he tears down the old shrines that had been set up by the kings of Israel during those times. He also celebrates the Passover, which had not been celebrated in a very long time. To the best of my knowledge, I think the Passover is only recorded as being celebrated twice during the period of kings, but I could be wrong on that. That's just my recollection on that. So, as the prophet Nahum had predicted, Assyria did fall. So after Ashurbanipal dies, his sons fight a series of civil wars. There are then more civil wars, and then some more civil wars on top of that, just in case they hadn't had enough civil wars. And a tribesman from the marshes south of Babylon, one of the Chaldean tribesmen, a person by the name of Nabopolassar, takes over Babylonia and starts a revolt against the Assyrians. He is helped by the fact that he makes an alliance with some powerful horse tribes in the Iranian mountains to the east. And the horse tribes and the Babylonians fight against the Assyrians until finally the Assyrians are pushed back to their capital, Nineveh. And Nineveh had huge walls. It was almost impregnable. But after 3 months of very, very heavy fighting, Nineveh falls. And honestly, the Babylonians are actually kind of astonished that they've managed to take this city. They talk about 3 months fighting, a month of looting. I think their words are a great defeat, a terrible defeat inflicted upon a great people, is their words on this. Nineveh falls in 612 BC, but even with the very end of their strength, the Assyrian armies are still quite strong. And some of them manage to fight their way out. And they fight their way westwards to a place called Haran, and then from Haran to Carchemish, which is on the banks of the Euphrates. And from Carchemish, they send these desperate messages to the Egyptians saying, come help us, we need to try and take the empire back. So the Egyptians march at great speed under the leadership of their pharaoh, a person called Necho II. And do you remember I was saying that Josiah had kind of pushed northwards into Israel to try and retake some of the lands of Israel? This meant that the Egyptian armies were trying to pass through roads that were controlled by Josiah. And Josiah decides, for whatever reason, to block the path of the Egyptians. Necho actually even says to him that he doesn't want to fight Josiah. He really wants to get to Carchemish as fast as he can. But Josiah decides to try and stop him. It's possible that Josiah was trying to emulate Hezekiah and sort of help the Babylonians against the Assyrians. We don't know, we can speculate, but yeah. So Josiah fights the Egyptians at a place called Megiddo and dies. He's not a match for the Egyptians in open warfare. This is the city of Megiddo. This is not where the battle takes place. The battle takes place nearby, but this is the city that it's near. So the prophet Habakkuk is probably active around this time, and Habakkuk prophesies that Judah will be invaded by the Babylonians. So now we're kind of into the last days of the kingdom of Judah. Egypt and Babylon fight for a couple of years. Josiah is killed in 609 BC. The Egyptians and Babylonians fight at Carchemish around 609. There's another battle 4 years later at 605, and this time the Egyptians are very badly defeated and have to flee all the way down to Egypt. Babylon then takes over the region, including Judah, and the king of Judah has to swear allegiance to the Babylonians. But the Babylonians don't trust him, and so they take away some high-ranking hostages, including the prophet Daniel. They're kind of right not to trust the king of Judah, because the king of Judah, a person called Jehoiakim, immediately revolts. Well, not immediately. He revolts about 4 years later, and I think 601 BC. And he revolts against Babylon, and the Babylonians are kind of busy fighting another war somewhere else, so they don't get around to him. But the Bible tells us that they tell the local kings to attack and do the kind of dirty work for them, that the Babylonians will get around to it when they get around to it. So this is a map of the region at the time. It's quite a good map, but it's probably, we're talking about maybe the year 600 BC. This map really depicts the years about maybe 570 to 560 BC, but it still gives a pretty good picture of what's going on after the fall of Assyria. It's also, unfortunately, in Ukrainian, but I can't help that. So this is the kingdom of Egypt. This is the kingdom of Lydia. This is the Babylonian Empire in red. And this green territory here is the kingdom belonging to the horse tribes, the Medes. So it's a really good map. It is just unfortunately a pity that it is in Ukrainian. The prophet Jeremiah is active around this time, and it's the prophet. If you read the book of Jeremiah, it's the longest book of the Bible in terms of word count, but it's really worth reading, like for all sorts of stuff. It also contains a huge amount of just historical information. It's just gems of info, just here, there, and everywhere. One of the things you'll pick up from reading the book of Jeremiah is that the society of Judah is kind of split into different factions, some of which support Babylon, some of which support Judah to basically fight off everyone. Some of them are pro-Egyptian, some of them want to go and make alliances with other smaller kings. It's just not clear what is to be done. And there are real difficulties in reconciling loyalty to God while also having to pay homage to a pagan king from elsewhere. And there are also different voices claiming to speak for God. The book of Jeremiah talks about other prophets who oppose Jeremiah. They claim to speak for God, even though they directly contradict Jeremiah. So if you're a person in Jerusalem, this is a confusing time. However, it is from this time period that we actually have the earliest preserved words of the Old Testament. Do you remember I was talking about how papyrus does not preserve well in this environment? However, there were some amulets. People would sort of make them to go and sort of bind around their wrists. And these are known as the Ketef Hinum amulets because they were found in, I think they were found in a rubbish dump not that far outside of Jerusalem. And these actually contain the words, the priestly blessing. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, basically, is what's written on these. So after I was talking about how the Babylonians knew that that Judah had revolted, but that they were getting around to it a little bit later. When they do get around to it, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, is dead, has died of natural causes. His son, who is known as either Jeconiah or Jehoiakim, I've referred to him as Jeconiah here because it's slightly less confusing. He reigns for a very short time, and then the Babylonians come and they deport him back to Babylon. They are sick of his revolt. They also deport other people from Jerusalem, including the prophet Ezekiel, shown in this illustration here. This is one of the more famous visions of Ezekiel. This is the vision of the Valley of the Dry Bones. Anyway, the Babylonians have told, they've deported Jeconiah to Babylon, and they've placed another member of the royal family, a guy called Zedekiah on the throne of Judah. And they basically sort of said, don't revolt. We're running out of patience. So naturally, Zedekiah, after a period of a couple of years, revolts. So we know this from the book of Jeremiah, from the book of Kings, from other parts of the Old Testament. But we also know it from primary documents. So again, remember that I was talking about how papyrus does not last very long. Sometimes when the people of Judah were writing short letters to each other, they would not write on papyrus, they would write on little bits of pottery, and those bits of pottery do last. So this is a letter from a sub-commander in the hills to a commander of the city of Lachish. Remember, Lachish is quite a fortified area that has been refortified for this war. So the letters are quite fascinating. It refers to the fact that the Babylonian army was much stronger than the army of Judah. And the people of Judah, like in the time of Hezekiah against the Assyrians, seem to have planned to fortify their cities, sit tight in their cities, and wait for the Egyptians to come and help them. It's not clear, by the way, if the Egyptian help ever comes. It seems like it never does. But if everyone is kind of stuck in their cities, how do you know not to surrender? And the answer is fire signals. Kind of like there are people in the cities, but there are also warriors hiding in the hills from the Babylonians. And at nighttime, they'll come out and they'll send off a quick series of fire signals to communicate messages from one city to another, and then go back into hiding. We don't know exactly how they did these signals. It may have been very simple, like just kind of like, we're still here. It might have been very complex, like Morse code. We don't know, but it's quite fascinating. It is referenced once or twice in the Bible, but it's also mentioned in these primary documents. So this is actually one of the letters. May Yahweh cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. And now, according to everything which my Lord has sent, this has your servant done. I wrote on the sheet according to everything which you sent to me. And may my Lord be apprised that we are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah. And it's a little unclear what's happening here, but it seems as if this message is being sent in the very middle of the war, that Azekah has fallen. Azekah is the third city of Judah, as the third most fortified. So you're reading kind of military reports in the middle of the war that's being talked about. I don't have time to quote all the letters. There are not that many of them. You can read them online if you want. Some of them do actually talk about people gone down to Egypt. Some of them talk about prophets in Jerusalem. If you read these letters and then read the book of Jeremiah, the picture that they both give are just, they're so close together. It's quite extraordinary. During this time, Jeremiah is pleading with the king to basically make peace with the Babylonians, that God has said, don't do this revolt. But the nobles of Jerusalem are committed to the revolt. In fact, the king is afraid that if he makes peace, his nobles will kill him. And we know the names of some of the nobles who oppose Jeremiah and who are forcing the king, because the book of Jeremiah records their names. And we actually have some of their seals. So these are the seals of two of the nobles mentioned in Jeremiah, a guy called Gedalia, son of Pashur, and another fellow called Jugal, son of Shelemiah. And these are very minor biblical characters, but it is interesting nonetheless to see that these guys they existed, they were here. And finally, the siege ends. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled towards the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. So this is basically the end of the kingdom of Judah. Babylonians are not quite, but nearly out of patience. They decide that Jerusalem is too dangerous to be left, and they break down the walls, they burn the city, and they destroy the temple. Also, anyone who was involved in the revolt is killed. They execute anyone who's involved, except for the king, who they blind and take to Babylon. Other sort of nobility who weren't directly involved in the revolt are all deported to Babylon. There are some common people in the countryside who are left, and these are placed under the leadership of a person called Gedalia. Now, Gedalia, this is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. Gedalia is we think he's a member of the royal household, but not directly in line for the throne. And he will be allowed to rule Judah as a governor, not as a king, as a governor. And this is kind of the Babylonian mercy. This is the last straw that they will sort of give to the people of Judah. And anyway, after the Babylonians begin to withdraw, Gedalia rules the province from a place called Mizpah. And all the soldiers who had been hiding out in the hills doing their little fire signals, they kind of come back in from the cold. And they basically try and sort of rejoin Gedalia at Mizpah. And unfortunately, not all of them sort of basically make peace with the new not all of them accept the war is over. Some of them have just turned into bandits. And local kings are using these bandits to basically try and stir up trouble in Judah and destabilize the region. So we can see this in the book of Jeremiah. Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the army officers still in the open country came to Gedalia at Mizpah and said to him, "Don't you know that Balus, king of the Ammonites, has sent Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, to take your life?" But Gedalia, son of Ahikam, did not believe them. So Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, is a Judah army officer who has not made peace, as it were. And the other guys are Johanan, son of Kareah, is one of the ones who has accepted the new order. And Gedalia is murdered by Ishmael, and Jeremiah describes the murder. After the murder of Gedalia, the people of Judah are so terrified that the Babylonians will retaliate that everyone who's kind of left in the country effectively kind of flees and goes down to Egypt. And they take a very unwilling prophet Jeremiah with them. And that seems to be where Jeremiah passes away. And that's kind of the ending of the kingdom of Judah. And the land is nearly depopulated at this point. People have either fled to Egypt or have been deported to Babylon. So you can actually see, this is a picture here, a romanticized picture of the fall of Jerusalem, deportation of the people. This is the seal of Balus, the king of the Ammonites, who is mentioned in that last passage in Jeremiah. So it takes us then to Babylon. This is the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. It's currently now in Berlin, but it was transported brick by brick. But yeah, the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. So we now move to the Babylonian captivity. We should not think of the Babylonian, like the Jews who were deported to Babylon, they were treated well. Once they were deported and they survived the trip, they were treated well. They were not slaves. They were given their own villages and told live there in peace. They were watched, but they weren't treated as slaves. Some of them rose to positions of high authority in the Babylonian Empire. Daniel is the most obvious example. But the Jews who were deported are basically trying to understand what has happened to them, trying to understand what has happened to their kingdom, and they're hoping for the promised return. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm aware that we've kind of gone a tiny wee bit over. But does anyone have any questions?
You talked about Tiglath-Pileser taking Lachish and then stopping at Jerusalem. We know that there was a siege, and then there was the lepers coming out and finding a deserted camp.
No. There's some confusion there.
Sorry, I'm mixing up. But
yeah, there's some the story of the camp and the lepers. That's actually a war between an earlier war between Israel and Damascus.
Is there a reference from the Tiglath-Pileser side to why he didn't take Jerusalem?
It's not Tiglath-Pileser who's attacking Jerusalem. It's Sennacherib. So he doesn't actually reference why he doesn't take Jerusalem.
David?
Yeah. Hello. Hello. Yeah, so Sennacherib in his inscriptions about the campaign, he doesn't refer to why he doesn't take Jerusalem. Instead he makes a reference that he leaves Hezekiah trapped like a bird in a cage. Those are his words. He doesn't say why he doesn't finish the war. Yeah, that's never mentioned. He just, as far as he's concerned, it's done. He takes Lachish, that's it. And yeah, he basically we can surmise that something happened to make him sort of pull away. And of course, the Bible sort of fills in what exactly happened. But yeah, he doesn't say anything more than a bird in a cage, and that's it. That's where he leaves the story.
David, I had a question about you showed an amulet, and you had mentioned that parchments and the papyrus would degenerate. So what were the amulets made of?
Silver.
David, my sound is not very good quality of Israel, please.
Beg your pardon, sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
My sound quality is not good. Would you mind touching back on the lost tribes of Israel, please?
Yeah, sure. So we know that they are deported. We don't really hear too much of them after that. It seems to be kind of implied from, and I think probably other people on the call probably know more about this than myself. It seems to be kind of implied that later on that when the Jews return to Jerusalem, without spoiling the next talk for tomorrow, that when the Jews return to Jerusalem, that effectively the tribes all return. So it's quite possible that when so any sort of the Israelites who were deported from Samaria to Assyria, any of them that kind of wanted to just kind of assimilate, probably did assimilate. Any of them who still worshipped God and still were wanting to retain that identity, probably merged with the deportees of Judah when those were later deported by Babylon. So when, say, for example, people return at the time of Cyrus, about maybe the year 539 BC, it's probable that a lot of the lost tribes actually returned then as well. But we don't really. I'm cautious about trying to say too much about the lost tribes. The answer is we just don't know for certain about a lot of these guys. Yeah, I'm just very cautious about trying to sort of say things definitively. What questions were you thinking of exactly about them?
Well, all I was able to hear is that you thought that they were nonsense, but if you say that
Oh,
it's
no,
implied.
sorry. No, not that they were nonsense, that a lot of nonsense is talked about them. For example, I'll give you an example.
Got it. Okay,
there was a group of
but you
people.
said,
Sorry, what?
no,
Sorry.
go ahead.
The sound seems to be breaking up a little bit. When I said that, I may have perhaps misspoken. But what I was thinking of was there was a particular group of people in the 1800s who actually thought that that the lost tribes of Israel were actually in England, and that the Ark of the Covenant was in Ireland at some point, and they had a whole pile of stupid reasons why they thought that. And when I was talking about a lot of nonsense, talked about the lost tribes of Israel, I was meaning that type of kind of conspiracy theory that was popular in the 1800s.
Okay, you're breaking up. I'm sorry, David, you're breaking up on my end. We'll have to finish this another way, okay?
Sure.
Thank you, though.
No worries. Are there any other questions, or how are people finding things?
That's great, David. Thank you.
Yeah, Colin, you probably would have a bit more knowledge than myself on the return of the 10 tribes and so on. Like, it was my understanding they were kind of merged in upon the return, but I could perhaps have picked that up wrong a little bit.
No, that sounds entirely fair. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. If people are happy, might finish up there if that works for people.
Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks all. Take care.